The bards still sing of that battle, though the gods only know how they invent the details they embroider into the tale, because to hear their songs you would think none of us could have survived Lugvale, and maybe none of us should. It was desperate. It was also, though the bards do not admit as much, a defeat for Arthur. Gorfithid's first attack was a howling rush of maddened spearmen who charged into the ford. Sagramor ordered us forward, and we met them in the river, where the clash of the shields was like a crack of thunder exploding in the valley's mouth. The enemy had the advantage of numbers, but their attack was channeled by the ford's margins, and we could afford to bring men from our flanks to thicken our centre. We in the front rank had time to thrust once, then we crouched behind our shields and simply shoved at the enemy line, while the men in our second rank fought across our heads. The ring of sword blades and clatter of shield bosses and clashing of spear shafts was deafening. But remarkably few men died, for it is hard to kill in the crush as two locked shield walls grind against each other. Instead, it becomes a pushing match. The enemy grasps your spearhead so you cannot pull it back. There is hardly room to draw a sword, and all the time the enemy's second rank are raining sword, axe, and spear blows on helmets and shield edges. The worst injuries are caused by men thrusting blades beneath the shields, and gradually a barrier of crippled men builds at the front to make the slaughter even more difficult. Only when one side pulls back can the other then kill the crippled enemies stranded at the battle's tide line. We prevailed on that first attack, not so much out of valour, but because Morfans pushed his 6 horsemen through the crush of our men and used his long horse spears to thrust down on the crouching enemy front line. "Shields! Shields!" I heard Morfan shouting, as the 6 horses' vast weight buckled our shield line forward. Our rear-rank men hoisted their shields high to protect the big war horses from the rain of enemy spears, while we in the front rank crouched in the river and tried to finish off the men who recoiled from the horsemen's thrusts. I sheltered behind Arthur's polished shield and stabbed with Howlbane whenever a gap offered in the enemy's line. I took 2 mighty blows to the head, but the helmet cushioned both, even if my skull did ring for an hour afterwards. One spear struck my scale armour, but could not pierce it. The man who launched that spear lunge was killed by Morfans, and after his death the enemy lost heart and splashed back to the river's northern bank. They took their wounded, all but a handful, who were too close to our line, and that handful we killed before we retreated to our own bank. We had lost 6 men to the other world, and twice that many to wounds. "You shouldn't be in the front line," Sagramor told me, as he watched our wounded being carried away. "They'll see you're not Arthur." "They're seeing that Arthur fights," I said, "unlike Gorfithid or Gundlius." The enemy kings had been close to the fight, but never close enough to use their weapons. Eorwith and Tanaburs were screaming at Gorfithid's men, encouraging them to the slaughter and promising them the rewards of the gods. But while Gorfithid reorganized his spearmen, a group of masterless men waded the river to attack on their own. Such warriors relied on a display of bravery to bring them riches and rank, and these 30 desperate men charged in a screaming rage once they were through the deepest part of the river. They were either drunk or battle-mad, for 30 alone attacked our whole force. The reward for their success would have been land, gold, forgiveness of their crimes, and lordly status in Gorfithid's court. But 30 men were not enough. They hurt us, but died doing it. They were all fine spearmen with shield hands thick with warrior rings, but each now faced 3 or 4 enemies. A whole group rushed towards me, seeing in my armour and white plume the fastest route to glory. But Sagramor and my wolf-tailed spearmen met and matched them. One huge man was wielding a Saxon axe. Sagramor killed him with his dark-curved blade, then plucked the axe from the dying hand and hurled it at another spearman, and all the while he was chanting his own weird battle song in his native tongue. A last swordsman attacked me, and I parried his scything blow with the iron boss of Arthur's shield, knocked his own shield aside with Howlbane, then kicked him in the groin. He doubled over, too hurt to cry out, and Issa rammed a spear into his neck. We stripped the dead attackers of their armour, their weapons and their jewellery, and left their bodies at the ford's edge as a barrier to the next attack. That attack came soon, and came hard. Like the first, this third assault was made by a mass of spearmen, only this time we met them at the near river bank, where the press of men behind the enemy's front rank forced their leading spearmen to stumble on the piled bodies. Their stumbling opened them to our counterattack, and we shouted in triumph as we slashed our red spears forward. Then the shields cracked together again, dying men screamed and called on their gods, and the swords rang loud as the anvils in Magnus. I was again in the front rank, crammed so close to the enemy line that I could smell the mead on their breath. One man tried to snatch the helmet from my head, and lost his hand to a sword stroke. The pushing match started again, and again it seemed that the enemy must force us back by sheer weight. But again Morfans brought his heavy horses through the crush, and again the enemy hurled spears that clattered on our shields, and once again Morfans' men thrust down with their long horsemen's spears, and once again the enemy pulled back. The bards say the river ran red, which is not true, though I did see tendrils of blood fading downstream from the wounded who tried and failed to get back through the ford.
"We could fight the bastards here all day,"
Morfan said. His horse was bleeding, and he had dismounted to treat the animal's wound. I shook my head. "There's another ford upriver." I pointed westwards. "They'll have spearmen on this bank soon enough." Those outflanking enemy came sooner than I thought. For 10 minutes later, a shout from our left flank warned us that a group of enemy had indeed crossed the river to the west, and was now advancing along our bank.
"Time to go back,"
Sagramor told me. His clean-shaven black face was smeared with blood and sweat, but there was joy in his eyes, for this was proving to be a fight that would make the poet struggle for new words to describe a battle, a fight that men would remember in smoky halls for winters to come, a fight that, even lost, would send a man in honour to the warrior halls of the other world.
"Time to draw them in,"
Sagramor said, then shouted the order to withdraw, so that slowly and cumbersomely our whole force retreated past the village with its Roman building and stopped 100 paces beyond. Our left flank was now anchored on the Vale's steep western side, while our right was protected by the marshy ground that stretched towards the river. Even so, we were much more vulnerable than we had been at the ford, for our shield wall was now desperately thin, and the enemy could attack all along its length. It took Gorfithid a whole hour to bring his men across the river and array them in a new shield line. I guessed it was already afternoon, and I glanced behind me for some sign of Galahad or Tudric's men, but I saw no one approaching. Nor, I was glad to see, were there any men on the western hill, where Nemui's ghost fence guarded our flank. But Gorfithid hardly needed men there, for his army was now bigger than ever. New contingents had come from Branagenium, and Gorfithid's commanders were tugging and shoving those newcomers into the shield wall. We watched the captains using their long spears to straighten the enemy's line, and all of us, despite the defiance we shouted, knew that for every man we had killed at the river, 10 more had come across the ford.
"We'll never hold them here,"
Sagramor said, as he watched the enemy forces grow.
"We'll have to go back to the tree fence."
But then, before Sagramor could give the order to retreat, Gorfithid himself rode forward to challenge us. He came alone, without even his son, and he came with just a sheathed sword and a spear, for he had no arm to hold a shield. Gorfithid's gold-trimmed helmet, that Arthur had returned the week of his betrothal to Kynwyn, was crowned with the spread wings of a golden eagle, and his black cloak was spread across his horse's rump. Sagramor growled at me to stay where I was, and strode forward to meet the king. Gorfithid used no reins, but spoke to his horse that obediently stopped 2 paces away from Sagramor. Gorfithid rested his spear butt on the ground, then forced his helmet's cheek-pieces aside so that his sour face showed.
"You're Arthur's black demon,"
he accused Sagramore, spitting to avert any evil.
"And your whore-loving lord shelters behind your sword."
Gorfithid spat again, this time towards me.
"Why don't you talk to me, Arthur?"
he shouted.
"Lost your tongue?"
"My lord Arthur," Sagramore answered in his heavily accented British, "is saving his breath to sing his victory song." Gorfithid hefted his long spear.
"I'm one-handed,"
he shouted at me.
"but I'll fight you."
I said nothing, nor did I move. Arthur, I knew, would never fight in single battle against a crippled man, though Arthur would never have stayed silent either. By now he would have been pleading with Gorfithid for peace. Gorfithid did not want peace. He wanted slaughter. He rode up and down our line, controlling his horse with his knees and shouting at our men.
"You are dying because your lord can't keep his hands off a whore. You're dying for a bitch with a wet rump, for a bitch in perpetual heat. Your souls will be cursed. My dead are already feasting in the other world, but your souls will become their throw pieces. And why will you die? For his red-headed whore?"
He pointed his spear at me, then rode his horse directly at me. I pulled back lest he saw through the helmet's eye-slit that I was not Arthur, and my spearmen closed protectively around me. Gorfithid laughed at my apparent timidity. His horse was close enough for my men to touch, but Gorfithid showed no fear of their spears as he spat at me.
"Woman!"
he called out, his worst insult, then touched his horse with his left foot, and the beast turned and galloped back towards his army. Sagramore turned to us and raised his arms.
"Back!" he shouted. "Back to the fence! Quick now! Back!"
We turned our backs on the enemy and hurried away, and a great shout went up as they saw our twin banners retreat. They thought we were running, and they broke their ranks to pursue us, but we had too great a start on them, and we had streamed through the gap in the barricade long before any of Gorfithid's men could reach us. Our line spread behind the fence, while I took Arthur's proper place in the very centre of the line, where the road ran through the empty gap between the felled trees. We deliberately left the gap without any obstacles in the hope that it would draw Gorfithid's attacks, and thus give our flanks time to rest. I raised Arthur's two banners there, and waited for the assault. Gorfithid roared at his disordered spearmen to make a new shield wall. King Gundlius commanded the enemy's right flank, and Prince Kinoglas the left. That arrangement suggested that Gorfithid was not going to take our bait of the open gap, but intended to assault all along the line.
"You stay here!"
Sagramore shouted at our spearmen.
"You're warriors! You're going to prove it now! You stay here! You kill here! And you win here!"
Morfans had forced his wounded horse a small way up the western hill, from where he looked north up the vale, judging whether this was the moment to sound the horn and summon Arthur. But enemy reinforcements were still crossing the ford, and he came back without putting the silver to his lips. Gorfithid's horn sounded instead. It was a raucous ram's horn that did not send his shield line forward, but instead provoked a dozen naked madmen to burst out of the enemy's line and rush on our centre. Such men have put their souls in the gods' keeping, then fuddled their senses with a mixture of mead, thorn-apple juice, mandrake, and belladonna, which can give a man waking nightmares, even as it takes away his fears. Such men might be mad, drunk, and naked, but they were also dangerous, for they had only one aim, and that was to bring down the enemy commanders. They rushed at me, mouths foaming from the magical herbs they had been chewing, and with their spears held overhead ready to drive down. My wolf-tailed spearmen advanced to meet them. The naked men did not care about death. They threw themselves on my spearmen as if they welcomed their spear points. One of my men was driven backwards, with a naked brute clawing at his eyes and spitting into his face. Issa killed that fiend, but another managed to kill one of my best men, and then screamed his victory, legs apart, arms upheld, and bloody spear in bloody hand. And all my men thought the gods must have deserted us. But Sagramor ripped the naked man's belly open, then half-severed his head before the corpse had even fallen to the ground. Sagramor spat onto the naked, eviscerated corpse, then spat again towards the enemy shield wall. That wall, seeing the centre of our line was disordered, charged. Our hastily realigned centre buckled when the mass of spearmen slammed home. The thin line of men stretched across the road bent like a sapling, but somehow we held. We were cheering each other, calling on the gods, stabbing and cutting, while Morfans and his horsemen rode all along the shield wall and threw themselves into the fight wherever the enemy seemed about to break through. The flanks of our shield wall were protected by the barricade, and so had an easier time. But in the centre, our fight was desperate. I was maddened by now, lost in the weltering joy of battle. I lost my spear to an enemy's grip, drew Halbane, but held back her first stroke to let an enemy's shield hammer into Arthur's polished silver. The shields banged together. Then the enemy's face showed for an instant, and I lanced Halbane forward and felt the pressure vanish from the shield. The man fell, his body making a barrier, over which his comrades had to climb. Isser killed one man, then took a spear thrust to his shield arm that soaked his sleeve in blood. He kept fighting. I was hacking madly in the space made by my fallen enemy to carve a hole in Gorfithid's shield wall. I saw the enemy king once, staring from his horse to where I screamed and slashed and dared his men to come and take my soul. Some did dare, thinking to make themselves the stuff of songs, but instead they made themselves into corpses. Halbane was soaked in blood, my right hand was sticky with it, and the sleeve of the heavy scale coat was smeared with it, but none of it was mine. The centre of our line, unprotected by the tangling trees, very nearly did break once, but two of Morfan's horsemen used their beasts to plug the gap. One of the horses died, screaming and thrashing its hooves as it bled to death on the road. Then our shield wall mended itself, and we shoved back at the enemy, who slowly were being choked by the press of dead and dying bodies that lay between the two front ranks. Nimue was behind us, shrieking and hurling curses. The enemy pulled away, and at last we could rest. All of us were bloody and mud-stained, and our breath came in huge gasps. Our sword and spear arms were weary. News of comrades was passed along the ranks. Minak was dead, this man wounded, another man dying. Men bandaged their neighbours' wounds, then swore oaths to defend each other to the death. I tried to ease the galling pressure of Arthur's armour that had rubbed great sores on my shoulders. The enemy was wary now. The tired men who faced us had felt our swords and learned to fear us. Yet still they attacked again. This time it was Gundlius's royal guard that assaulted our centre, and we met them at the bloody pile of dead and dying that was left from the last attack. And that gory ridge saved us, for the enemy spearmen could not clamber over the bodies and protect themselves at the same time. We broke their ankles, cut open their legs, then speared them as they fell to make the bloody ridge higher. Black ravens circled the ford, their wings ragged against the dun sky. I saw Legesak, the traitor who had yielded Norwenna to Gundlius's sword, and I tried to cut my way through to him, but the tide of battle swept him away from Halbane. Then the enemy pulled back again, and I hoarsely ordered some of my men to fetch skins of water from the river. We were all thirsty, for the sweat had poured off us, mingling with blood. I had one scratch on my sword hand, but nothing else. I had been to the death pit, and always reckoned that was why I was lucky in battle. The enemy began putting new troops in their front line. Some carried Keenaglass's eagle, some Gundlius's fox, and a few had emblems of their own. Then a cheer sounded behind me, and I turned, expecting to see Tudric's men arriving in their Roman uniforms. But instead, it was Galahad who came alone on a sweating horse. He slid to a halt behind our line, and half fell off the horse in his haste to reach us. "I thought I'd be too late," he said. "Are they coming?" I asked. He paused, and even before he spoke I knew that we had been abandoned. "No," he said at last. I swore, and looked back to the enemy. It was the gods alone who had saved us in the last attack, but the gods alone knew how long we could hold now. "No one is coming?" I asked bitterly. "A few, maybe." Galahad gave the bad news in a low voice. "Tudric believes we're doomed. Agricola says they should help us, but Murig says we must be left to die. They're all arguing, but Tudric did say that any man who wants to die here could follow me. Maybe some are on the way." I prayed there were, for some of Gorfithid's levy had arrived on the western hill now, though none of that ragged horde had yet dared to cross Nimui's ghost fence. We could hold for 2 more hours, I thought, and after that we were doomed, though Arthur would surely come first. "No sign of the Black Shield Irish?" I asked Galahad. "No, thank God," he said. And it was one small blessing, on a day almost bereft of blessings. Though a half-hour after Galahad came, we did at last receive some reinforcements. 7 men walked north towards our battered shield wall. 7 men in war gear, carrying spears, shields, and swords, and the symbol on the shields was the Hawk of Kernau, our enemy. Yet these men were no enemies. They were 6 scarred and hardened fighters, led by their Edling, Prince Tristan. He explained his presence when the excitement of greeting was over. "Arthur fought for me once, and I have long wanted to repay the debt." "With your life?" Sagramor asked grimly. "He risked his," Tristan said simply. I remembered him as a tall, handsome man, and so he still was. But the years had added a weary and tired look to his face, as though he had suffered too many disappointments. "My father," he added ruefully, "may never forgive my coming here, but I could never have forgiven my absence." "How's Salina?" I asked him. "Salina?" He took a few seconds to remember the small girl who had come to accuse Owain at Caer Cadern. "Oh, Salina. You're married now to a fisherman." He smiled. "You gave her the kitten, didn't you?" We put Tristan and his men in our centre, the place of honour on this battlefield. Yet when the enemy's next assault came, it was not against the centre, but against the tree fence protecting our flanks. For a time the shallow trench and the fence's tangling branches caused them havoc, but they learned swiftly enough to use the felled trees to protect themselves, and in some places they burst clean through and bent our line backwards again. But again we held them. And Griffith, my erstwhile enemy, made a name for himself by cutting down Nacians, Gundlius's champion. The shields crashed incessantly, spears broke, swords shattered, and shields split, as the exhausted fought the weary. On the hilltop, the enemy levy gathered to watch from beyond Nimui's ghost fence, as Morfans once again forced his tired horse up the perilously steep slope. He stared northwards, and we watched him, and prayed that he would blow the horn. He stared for a long time, but he must have been satisfied that all the enemy forces were now trapped in the vale, for he put the silver horn to his lips and blew the blessed summons across the din of battle. Never was a horn call more welcome. Our whole line surged forward, and scarred swords hammered at the enemy with a new energy. The silver horn, so pure and clear, called again and again, a hunting call to the slaughter. And each time it sounded, our men pressed forward into the branches of the felled trees to cut and stab and scream at the enemy, who, suspecting some trickery, glanced nervously around the vale as they defended themselves. Gorfithid shouted at his men to break us now, and his royal guard led the attack on our centre. I heard Kernau's men screaming their war cry as they paid their Edling's debt. Nimue was among our spearmen, and wielding a sword with both hands. I shouted at her to get back, but the bloodlust had swamped her soul, and she fought like a fiend. The enemy was scared of her, knowing that she was of the gods, and men tried to evade rather than fight her. But all the same, I was glad when Galahad thrust her away from the fight. Galahad might have come late to the battle, but he fought with a savage glee that drove the enemy back from the twitching pile of dead and dying men. The horns sounded a last time, and Arthur, at last, charged. His armoured spearmen had come from their hiding place north of the river, and now their horses foamed through the ford like a tide of thunder. They crashed over the bodies left by the early fighting, and brought their bright spears down into the charge as they seared into the enemy's rearward units. Men scattered like chaff as the iron-shod horses drove deep into Gorfethid's army. Arthur's men divided into two groups that cut deep channels through that press of spearmen. They charged, then left their spears fixed in the dead, and then made more dead with their swords. And for a moment, for a glorious moment, I thought the enemy would break. But then Gorfethid saw the same danger, and he shouted at his men to form a new shield wall facing north. He would sacrifice his rearward men, and instead make a new line of spears from the backmost ranks of his forward troops. And that new line held. Owain, so long ago, had been right when he told me that not even Arthur's horses would charge home against a well-made shield wall. Nor would they. Arthur had brought panic and death to a third of Keenaglas's army, but the rest were now formed properly, and they defied his handful of cavalry. And still the enemy outnumbered us. Behind the tree fence, our line was nowhere more than 2 men deep, and in places it was just 1. Arthur had failed to cut through to us, and Gorfethid knew that Arthur never would cut through, so long as he kept a shield wall facing the horses. He planted that shield wall, abandoning the lost third of his army to Arthur's mercy, then turned the rest of his men to face Sagramor's shield wall again. Gorfethid now knew Arthur's tactics, and he had defeated them. So he could hurl his spearmen into battle with a new confidence, though this time, instead of assaulting all along our line, he concentrated his attack along the Vale's western edge, in an attempt to turn our left flank. The men on that flank fought. They killed and they died, but few men could have held the line for long, and none could have held it once Gundlius's Silurians outflanked us by climbing the lower slopes of the hill beneath the ghastly ghost fence. The attack was brutal, and the defence just as horrid. Morfan's surviving horsemen hurled themselves at the Silurians. Nimue spat curses at them, and Tristan's fresh men fought there like champions. But if we had possessed double our numbers, we could not have stopped the enemy from outflanking us. And so our shield wall, like a snake recoiling, collapsed onto the riverbank, where we made a defensive half-circle about 2 banners, and the few wounded men we had managed to carry back with us. It was a terrible moment. I saw our shield wall break, saw the enemy begin the slaughter of scattered men, and then I ran with the rest into the desperate huddle of survivors. We just had time to make a crude shield wall. Then we could only watch as Gorfethid's triumphant forces pursued and killed our fugitives. Tristan survived, as did Galahad and Sagramor. But that was small consolation, for we had lost the battle, and all that remained for us now was to die like heroes. In the northern half of the Vale, Arthur was still held by the shield wall, while to the south, our wall, that had resisted its enemies all that long day, had been broken, and its remnants surrounded. We had gone into battle 200 strong, and now we numbered just over 100 men. Prince Keenaglas rode forward to ask for our surrender. His father was commanding the men facing Arthur, and the King of Powys was content to leave the destruction of Sagramor's remaining spearmen to his son and to King Gundlius. Keenaglas at least did not insult my men. He curbed his horse a dozen paces from our line, and raised an empty right hand to show he came in truce.
"Men of Dumnonia," Keenaglas called, "you have fought well, but to fight further is to die. I offer you life. Use your sword once before you ask brave men to surrender," I shouted at him.
"Afraid to fight, are you?"
Sagramor jeered.
for so far none of us had seen Gorfythid, Keenaglas, or Gundlius in the front of the enemy shield wall. King Gundlius sat on his horse a few paces behind Prince Keenaglas. The Mooie was cursing him, but whether or not he was aware of her I could not tell. If he was, he could not have been worried, for we were all now trapped and surely doomed.
"Or fight me now!" I shouted at Keenaglas. "Man to man, if you dare!"
Keenaglas gazed at me sadly. I was blood-stained, mud-covered, sweaty, bruised, and hurting, while he was elegant in a short suit of scale armour and with a helmet surmounted by eagle feathers. He half smiled at me.
"I know you're not Arthur," he said, "for I saw him on horseback. But whoever you are, you have fought nobly. I offer you life."
I pulled the sweaty, confining helmet off my head and tossed it into the centre of our half-circle.
"You know me, Lord Prince," I said.
"Lord Derval," he named me, then did me honour.
"Lord Derval Cadern," he said, "if I stand surety for your life, and for the lives of your men, will you surrender?"
"Lord Prince," I said, "I do not command here. You must speak to Lord Sagramore." Sagramore stepped up beside me and took off his black-spired helmet that had been pierced by a spear, so that his black curly hair was matted with blood.
"Lord Prince," he said warily.
"I offer you life," Keenaglas said, "so long as you surrender." Sagramore pointed his curved sword to where Arthur's horsemen dominated the northern part of the vale.
"My lord has not surrendered," he told Keenaglas, "so I cannot. But nevertheless," he raised his voice, "I release my men from their oaths. I also," I called to my men.
I'm sure some were tempted to leave the ranks, but their comrades growled at them to stay, or perhaps the growl was simply the sound of tired men's defiance. Prince Keenaglas waited a few seconds, then took 2 thin gold torques from a pouch at his belt. He smiled at us. "I salute your bravery, Lord Sagramore. I salute you, Lord Derval." He threw the gold so that it landed at our feet. I picked mine up and bent the ends apart so that it would fit around my neck. "And Derval Cadern," Keenaglas added. His round, friendly face was smiling. "Lord Prince, my sister asked that I should greet you, and so I do." My soul, so close to death, seemed to leap with joy at the greeting. "Give her my greetings, Lord Prince," I answered, "and tell her I shall look forward to her company in the other world." Then the thought of never seeing Kynwyn again, in this world, overcame my joy, and suddenly I wanted to weep. Keenaglas saw my sadness. "You need not die, Lord Derval," he said. "I offer you life, and I stand surety for you. I offer you my friendship, too, if you will have it." "I would honour it, Lord Prince," I said. "But while my lord fights, I fight." Sagramore pulled his helmet on, wincing as the metal slid over the spear wound on his scalp. "I thank you, Lord Prince," he told Keenaglas, "and choose to fight you." Keenaglas turned his horse away. I looked at my sword, so battered and sticky. Then I looked at my surviving men. "If we did nothing else," I told them, "we made sure Gorfythid's army can't march on Dumnonia for many a long day. And maybe never. Who'd want to fight men like us twice?"
"The Black-Shield Irish would," Sagramore growled.
And he jerked his head towards the hillside, where the ghost fence had held our flank all day. And there, beyond the magic-ridden posts, was a war band with round black shields and the wicked long spears of Ireland. It was the garrison of Coles Hill, Oengus Mac Iron's Black-Shield Irish, who had come to join the killing. Arthur was still fighting. He had torn 1/3 of his enemy's army into red ruin, but the rest now held him checked. He charged again and again in his efforts to break that shield line, but no horse on earth would ride through a thicket of men, shields, and spears. Even Clanray failed him, and all that was left for him to do, I thought, was to thrust Excalibur deep into the blood-reddened soil and hope that the god Gothanon would come from the darkest abyss of the otherworld to his rescue. But no god came, nor did any man come from Magnus. We later learned that some volunteers had set out, but they arrived too late. Powys's levy stayed on the hill, too scared to cross the ghost fence, while beside them were gathered more than 100 Irish warriors. Those men began to walk south, aiming to walk around the fence's vengeful ghosts. In a half-hour, I thought, those Black Shield Irish would be joining Keenaglass's final attack. And so I went to Nimue. "Swim the river," I urged her. "You can swim, can't you?" She held up her left hand with its scar. "You die here, Derval," she said. "Then I die here." "You must hold your tongue," she said. "That's what you must do." And then stood on tiptoe and kissed me on the mouth. "Kill Gundlius for me, before you die," she pleaded. One of our spearmen began singing the death song of Werlina, and the rest of them took up the slow, sad melody. Cavan, his cloak blackened by blood, was hammering the socket of his spearhead with a stone, trying to tighten the shaft's fit. "I never thought it would come to this," I said to him. "Nor me, Lord," he said, looking up from his work. His wolf-tail plume was blood-soaked too, his helmet dented, and there was a rag bandaged about his left thigh. "I thought I was lucky," I said. "I always thought that. But perhaps every man does." "Not every man, Lord, no. But the best leaders do." I smiled my thanks. "I would have liked to have seen Arthur's dream come true," I said. "There'd be no work for warriors if it did," Cavan said dourly. "We'd all be clerks or farmers. Maybe it's better this way. One last fight, then down to the other world and into Mithras's service. We'll have a good time there, Lord. Plump women, good fighting, strong mead, and rich gold forever." "I shall be glad of your company there," I told him. But in truth, I was utterly bereft of joy. I did not want to go to the other world yet, not while Kynwyn still lived in this one. I pressed the armour at my chest to feel her small brooch, and I thought of the madness that would never now run its course. I said her name aloud, puzzling Cavan. I was in love, but I would die without ever holding my love's hand, or seeing her face again. Then I was forced to forget Kynwyn, for the Black Shield Irish of Demetia, instead of walking around the fence, had decided to risk the ghosts and cross it. Then I saw why. A druid had appeared on the hill to lead them through the spirit line. Nimue came to stand beside me, and stared up the hill to where the tall, white-cowled and white-robed figure strode long-legged down the steep slope. The Irish followed him, and behind their black shields and long spears came Powys's levy, with its mixed weaponry of bows, mattocks, axes, spears, single-sticks, and hay-forks. My men's singing faded away. They hefted spears and touched their shield edges on each other to make sure the wall was tight. The enemy, who had been readying their own shield wall to attack ours, now turned to watch as the druid brought the Irish down to the valley. Iorwith and Tanabers ran to meet him, but the newly come druid waved his long staff to order them out of his path, and then he pushed his robe's hood back, and we saw the long, plaited white beard and the swinging pigtail of his black-wrapped hair. It was Merlin. Nimue cried when she saw Merlin. Then she ran towards him. The enemy moved aside to let her pass, just as they parted to let Merlin walk towards her. Even on a battlefield, a druid could walk wherever he wanted, and this druid was the most famed and powerful in all the land. Nimue ran, and Merlin spread his arms to welcome her, and she was still sobbing as at last she found him again and threw her thin white arms around his body. And suddenly I was glad for her. Merlin kept one arm around Nimue as he strode towards us. Gorfithid had seen the druid's arrival, and now galloped his horse towards our part of the battlefield. Merlin raised his staff in greeting to the king, but ignored his questions. The Irish warband had stopped at the hill's foot, where they formed their grim black wall of shields. Merlin walked towards me, and, just as on the day when he had saved my life at Caersus, he came in stark, cold majesty. There was no smile on his dark face, no hint of joy in his deep eyes, just a look of such fierce anger that I sank to my knees and bowed my head as he came close. Sagramor did the same. Then suddenly our whole battered band of spearmen was kneeling to the druid. He reached out with his black staff and touched first Sagramor and then me on the shoulders. "Get up," he said, in a low, hard voice, before turning to face the enemy. He took his arm from around Nimue's shoulders and held his black staff level above his tonsured head with both hands. He stared at Gorfithid's army, then slowly lowered the staff, and such was the authority in that long, ancient, angry face, and in that slow, sure gesture, that the enemy all knelt to him. Only the two druids stayed standing, and the few horsemen remained in their saddles. "For 7 years," Merlin said, in a voice that reached clear across the vale and right up its deep centre, so that even Arthur and his men could hear him, "I have searched for the knowledge of Britain. I have searched for the power of our ancestors that we abandoned when the Romans came. I have searched for those things that will restore this land to its rightful gods, its own gods, our gods, the gods who made us, and who can be persuaded to come back to help us." He spoke slowly and simply, so that every man could hear and understand. "Now," he went on, "I need help. I need men with swords, men with spears, men with hearts unafraid, to go with me to an enemy place to find the last treasure of Britain. I seek the cauldron of Clithno Ithan. The cauldron is our power, our lost power, our last hope to make Britain once again into the island of the gods. I promise you nothing but hardship. I will give you no reward but death. I shall feed you nothing but bitterness, and will give you only gall to drink. But in return, I ask for your swords and your lives. Who will come with me to find the cauldron?" He asked the question abruptly. We had expected him to talk of this sprawling bloodletting that had turned a green veil red, but instead he had ignored the fight as though it was irrelevant, almost as if he had not even noticed that he had strayed onto a battlefield. "Who?" he asked again.
"Lord Merlin!"
Gorfithid shouted, before any man could respond. The enemy king pushed his horse through the ranks of his kneeling spearmen.
"Lord Merlin!"
His voice was angry and his face bitter.
"Gorfithid?"
Merlin acknowledged him.
"Your quest for the cauldron can wait 1 short hour?"
Gorfithid asked the question sarcastically.
"It can wait a year, Gorfithid ap Cadel. It can wait 5 years. It can wait forever. But it should not."
Gorfithid rode his horse into the open space between the spear walls. He was seeing his great victory jeopardized, and his claim to be the High King threatened by a druid, and so he turned his horse towards his men, pushed back the cheek pieces of his winged helmet, and raised his voice.
"It will be time to pledge spears to the cauldron's quest,"
he called to his men.
"but only when you have punished the whoremonger and drowned your spears in his men's souls. I have an oath to fulfill, and I will not let any man, even my Lord Merlin, deflect that oath's keeping. There can be no peace, no cauldron, while the whore's lover lives."
He turned and stared at the wizard.
You would save the whore lover by this appeal?
I would not care, Gorfethid ap Cadel, Merlin said, if the land opened and swallowed Arthur and his army. Nor if it engulfed yours as well.
Then we fight!
Gorfethid shouted, and he used his one arm to drag his sword free of its scabbard.
These men,
he spoke to his army, but pointed the sword towards our banners,
are yours. Their lands, their flocks, their gold, and their homes are yours. Their wives and daughters are now your horse. You have fought them this far. Would you now let them walk away? The cauldron will not vanish with their lives, but your victory will vanish if we do not finish what we came here to do. We fight.
There was a heartbeat of silence. Then Gorfethid's men stood and began to beat their spear shafts against their shields. Gorfethid gave Merlin a triumphant look, then kicked his horse back into his men's clamorous ranks. Merlin turned to Sagramor and me.
The Black Shield Irish, he said in a casual voice, are on your side. I talked to them. They will attack Gorfethid's men, and you shall have a great victory. May the gods give you strength.
He turned again, put an arm around Nemui's shoulders, and strode away through the enemy ranks that opened to let him through.
It was a good try,
Gunlius called to Merlin. The King of Powys was on the threshold of his great victory, and that giddy prospect had filled him with the confidence to defy the Druid. But Merlin ignored the crowing insult, and just walked away with Tanibers and Eorwith. Issa brought me Arthur's helmet. I crammed it back on my head, glad of its protection in these last few moments of battle. The enemy reformed its shield wall. Few insults were shouted now, for few men had energy for anything other than the grim slaughter that loomed on the river's bank. Gorfethid, for the first time all day, dismounted and took his place in the wall. He had no shield, but he would still lead this last attack that would crush his hated enemy's power. He raised his sword, held it aloft for a few heartbeats, then brought it down. The enemy charged. We thrust spears and shields forward to meet them, and the two walls crashed with a terrible sound. Gorfethid tried to thrust his sword past Arthur's shield, but I parried it and cut at him with Howlbane. The sword glanced off his helmet, severing an eagle wing. Then we were locked together by the pressure of the men thrusting from behind.
Push them!
Gorfethid shouted at his men. Then he spat at me over the shield.
Your whore lover,
he told me over the battle's din.
Hid while you fought.
She is no whore, Lord King, I said, and tried to free Howlbane from the crush, to give him a blow, but the sword was trapped fast by the pressure of shields and men.
She took enough gold from me, Gorfethid said, and I don't pay women whose legs don't part.
I heaved at Howlbane, and tried to stab at Gorfethid's feet, but the sword just glanced off the skirts of his armour. He laughed at my failure, spat at me again, then raised his head as he heard a dreadful screaming battle cry. It was the attack of the Irish. The black shields of Oengus mac Eirim always charged with an ululating scream, a terrible battle cry that seemed to suggest an inhuman delight in slaughter. Gorfethid shouted at his men to heave and cleave, to break our tiny shield wall, and for a few seconds the men of Powys and Siluria struck at us with a new frenzy, in the belief that the black shields were coming to their aid. But then new screams from the rearward ranks made them realize that treachery had changed the black shield's allegiance. The Irish sliced into Gorfethid's ranks, their long spears finding easy targets, and suddenly, swiftly, Gorfethid's men collapsed like a pricked waterskin. I saw the rage and panic across Gorfethid's face.
"Surrender, Lord King!"
I shouted to him. But his bodyguard found space to hack down with their swords, and for a few desperate seconds I was defending myself too hard to see what happened to the king, though Issa did shout that he saw Gorfethid wounded. Galahad was beside me, thrusting and parrying, and then, magically it seemed, the enemy was fleeing. Our men pursued, joining with the Black Shields to drive the men of Powys and Siluria like a flock of sheep to where Arthur's horsemen waited to kill. I looked for Gunlius, and saw him once among a mass of running, mud-covered, bloody men, and then I lost sight of him. The Vale had seen much death that day, but now it saw outright massacre, for nothing makes for easy killing like a broken shield wall. Arthur tried to stop the slaughter, but nothing could have checked that pent-up release of savagery, and his horsemen rode like avenging gods among the panicked mass, while we pursued and cut the fugitives down in an orgy of blood. Scores of the enemy succeeded in fleeing past the horsemen and crossing the ford to safety, but scores more were forced to take refuge in the village, where at last they found the time and space to make a new shield wall. Now it was their turn to be surrounded. The evening light was stretching across the vale, touching the trees with the first faint yellow sunlight of that long and bloody day, as we stopped around the village. We were panting, and our swords and spears were thick with blood. Arthur, his sword as red as mine, slid heavily from Llamre's back. The black mare was white with sweat, trembling, her pale eyes wide, while Arthur himself was bone-weary from his desperate fight. He had tried and tried again to break through to us. He had fought, his men told us, like a man possessed by the gods, even though it had seemed all that long afternoon as if the gods had deserted him. Now, despite being victor of the day, he was in distress as he embraced Sagramor and then hugged me. "I failed you, devil," he said. "I failed you." "No, Lord," I said. "We won." And I pointed with my battered, reddened sword at Gorfithid's survivors, who had rallied around the eagle banner of their trapped king. Gundlius's fox banner also showed there, though neither of the enemy kings was in view. "I failed," Arthur said. "I never broke through. There were too many." That failure galled him, for he knew only too well how close we had come to utter defeat. Indeed, he felt he had been defeated, for his vaunted horsemen had been held, and all he had been able to do was watch as we were cut down. But he was wrong. The victory was his, all his, for Arthur, alone of all the men of Dumnonia and Gwent, had possessed the confidence to offer battle. That battle had not gone as Arthur had planned. Tudric had not marched to help us, and Arthur's war horses had been checked by Gundlius's shield wall. But it was still a victory, and it had been brought about by one thing only: Arthur's courage in fighting at all. Merlin had intervened, of course, but Merlin never claimed the victory. That was Arthur's, and though, at the time, Arthur was full of self-recrimination, it was Lug Vale, the one victory Arthur always despised, that turned him into the eventual ruler of Britain. The Arthur of the poets, the Arthur who wearies the tongues of the bards, the Arthur for whose return all men pray in these dark days, was made great by that stumbling shambles of a fight. Nowadays, of course, the poets do not sing the truth about Lug Vale, and they make it sound like a victory as complete as the later battles. And perhaps they are right to shape their story thus, for in these hard times we need Arthur to have been a great hero from the very first. But the truth is that in those early years Arthur was vulnerable. He ruled Dumnonia by virtue of Owain's death and Bedwyn's support, but as the years of war ground on, there were many who wished him gone. Gorfithid and his supporters in Dumnonia, and, God forgive me, too many Christians were praying for Arthur's defeat. And that was why he fought, because he knew he was too weak not to fight. Arthur had to provide victory, or lose everything. And in the end, he did win, but only after coming within a blade's edge of disaster. Arthur crossed to embrace Tristan, then to greet Oengus mac Eirim, the Irish king of Demetia, whose contingent had saved the battle. Arthur, as ever, went to his knees before a king, but Oengus lifted him up and gave him a bear hug. I turned and stared at the vale as the two men talked. It was foul with broken men, pitiful with dying horses, and glutted with corpses and littered weapons. Blood stank, and the wounded cried. I felt more weary than I had ever felt in my life, and so did my men. But I saw that Gorfithid's levy had come down from the hill to start plundering the dead and wounded, and so I sent Cavan and a score of spearmen to drive them away. Ravens flapped black across the river to tear at dead men's bowels. I saw that the huts we had fired that morning still smoked. Then I thought of Kynwyn, and amid all that bestial horror, my soul suddenly lifted, as though on great white wings. I turned back in time to see Merlin and Arthur embrace. Arthur almost seemed to collapse in the druid's arms, but Merlin lifted and clasped him. Then the two of them walked towards the enemy's shields. Prince Keenaglas and the druid Eorwith came from the encircled shield wall. Keenaglas carried a spear but no shield, while Arthur had Excalibur in its scabbard, but no other weapon. He paced ahead of Merlin, and as he drew near to Keenaglas, he dropped to one knee and bowed his head. "Lord Prince," he said. "My father is dying," Keenaglas said. "A spear thrust took him in the back." He made it sound like an accusation, though everyone knew that once a shield wall broke, many men would die with their wounds behind. Arthur stayed on one knee. For a moment he did not seem to know what to say. Then he looked up at Keenaglas. "May I see him?" he asked. "I offended your house, Lord Prince, and insulted its honour. And though no insult was meant, I would still beg your father's forgiveness." It was Keenaglas's turn to seem bemused. Then he shrugged as though he was not certain he was making the right decision, but at last he gestured towards his shield wall. Arthur stood, and, side by side with the prince, went to see the dying King Gorfithid. I wanted to call out to Arthur not to go, but he was swallowed in the enemy's ranks before my muddled wits recovered. I cringed to think what Gorfithid would say to Arthur, and I knew Gorfithid would say those things, the same filthy things that he had spat at me across the rim of his spear-scarred shield. King Gorfithid was not a man to forgive his enemies, nor one to spare an enemy hurt, even if he was dying, especially if he was dying. It would be Gorfithid's final pleasure in this world to know that he had hurt his foe. Sagramor shared my fears, and both of us watched in anguish as, after a few moments, Arthur emerged from the defeated ranks with a face as dark as Cruachan's cave. Sagramor stepped towards him. "He lied, Lord," Sagramor said softly. "He always lied." "I know he lied," Arthur said, then shuddered. "But some untruths are hard to hear, and impossible to forgive." Anger suddenly swelled up inside him, and he drew Excalibur and turned fiercely on the trapped enemy.
"Does any man of you want to fight for your king's lies?"
he shouted as he paced up and down their line.
"Is there one of you, just one man willing to fight for that evil thing that dies with you? Just one! Or else I'll have your king's soul cursed to the last darkness. Come on! Fight!"
He flailed Excalibur at their raised shields.
"Fight, you scum!"
His rage was as terrible as anything the Vale had seen that whole day.
"In the name of the gods,"
he called,
"I declare your king a liar, a bastard, a thing without honor, a nothing."
He spat at them, then fumbled one-handed at the buckles of my leather breastplate that he still wore. He succeeded in freeing the shoulder straps, but not the waist, so that the breastplate hung in front of him like a blacksmith's apron.
"I'll make it easy for you,"
he yelled.
"No armor, no shield. Come and fight me. Prove to me that your bastard whoremongering king speaks truth. Not one of you?"
His rage was out of control, for he was in the gods' hands now, and spattering his anger at a world that cowered from his dreadful force. He spat again.
"You rancid horse!"
He whirled around as Keenaglas reappeared in the shield wall.
"You whelp!"
He pointed Excalibur at Keenaglas.
"You'd fight for that lump of dying filth?"
Keenaglas, like every man there, was shaken by Arthur's fury. But he walked weaponless from the shield wall, and then, just feet from Arthur, he sank to his knees. "We are at your mercy, Lord Arthur," he said, and Arthur stared at him. His body was tense, for all the rage and frustration of a day's fighting was boiling inside him, and for a second I thought that Excalibur would hiss in the dusk to strike Keenaglas's head from his shoulders. But then Keenaglas looked up. "I am now king of Powys, Lord Arthur, but at your mercy." Arthur closed his eyes. Then, still with his eyes shut, he felt for Excalibur's scabbard and thrust the long sword home. He turned away from Keenaglas, opened his eyes and stared at us, his spearmen, and I saw the madness pass away from him. He was still seething with anger, but the uncontrollable rage had passed, and his voice was calm as he begged Keenaglas to stand. Then Arthur summoned his banner-holders so that the twin standards of the dragon and the bear would add dignity to his words. "My terms are these," he said, so that everyone in the darkening vale could hear him. "I demand King Gundlius' head. He has kept it too long, and the murderer of my king's mother must be brought to justice. That granted, I ask only for peace between King Keenaglas and my king, and between King Keenaglas and King Tudric. I ask for peace between all Britons." There was an astonished silence. Arthur was the winner on this field. His forces had killed the enemy's king and captured Powys's heir, and every man in the Vale expected Arthur to demand a royal ransom for Keenaglas's life. Instead, he was asking for nothing but peace. Keenaglas frowned. "What of my throne?" he managed to ask. "Your throne is yours, Lord King," Arthur said. "Whose else can it be? Accept my terms, Lord King, and you are free to return to it." "And Gundlius's throne?" Keenaglas asked, perhaps suspecting that Arthur wanted Siluria for himself. "Is not yours," Arthur replied firmly, "nor mine. Together we shall find someone to keep it warm. Once Gundlius is dead," he added ominously. "Where is he?" Keenaglas gestured towards the village. "In one of the buildings, Lord." Arthur turned towards Powys's defeated spearmen, and raised his voice so that each man could hear him. "This war should never have been fought," he called. "That it was fought is my fault, and I accept that fault, and shall pay for it in any coin other than my life. To the Princess Kynwyn I owe more than apology, and shall pay whatever she demands. But all I now ask is that we should be allies. New Saxons come daily to take our land and enslave our women. We should fight them, not amongst ourselves. I ask for your friendship, and as a token of that desire I leave you your land, your weapons, and your gold. This is neither victory nor defeat." He gestured at the bloody, smoke-palled valley. "It is a peace. All I ask is peace and one life, that of Gundlius." He looked back to Keenaglas and lowered his voice. "I wait your decision, Lord King." The druid Eorwith hurried to Keenaglas's side, and the two men spoke together. Neither seemed to believe Arthur's offer, for warlords were not usually magnanimous in victory. Battle winners demanded ransom, gold, slaves, and land. Arthur wanted only friendship. "What of Gwent?" Keenaglas asked Arthur. "What will Tudric want?" Arthur made a show of looking about the darkening valley. "I see no men of Gwent, Lord King. If a man is not party to a fight, then he cannot be party to the settlement afterward. But I can tell you, Lord King, that Gwent craves for peace. King Tudric will ask for nothing except your friendship, and the friendship of my king. A friendship we shall mutually pledge never to break." And I am free to go, if I give you that pledge? Keenaglass asked suspiciously. Wherever you wish, Lord King. Though I ask your permission to come to you at Caer-Seuss to talk further. And my men are free to go? Keenaglass asked. With their weapons, their gold, their lives, and my friendship, Arthur answered. He was at his most earnest, desperate to ensure that this was the last battle ever to be fought among the Britons, though he had taken good care, I noticed, to mention nothing of Rattay. That surprise could wait. Keenaglass still seemed to find the offer too good to be true, but then, perhaps remembering his former friendship with Arthur, he smiled. You shall have your peace, Lord Arthur. On one last condition, Arthur said unexpectedly and harshly, yet not loudly, so that only a few of us could hear his words. Keenaglass looked wary, but waited. Promise me, Lord King, Arthur said, upon your oath and upon your honour, that at his death your father lied to me. Peace hung on Keenaglass's answer. He momentarily closed his eyes as though he was hurt. Then he spoke. My father never cared for truth, Lord Arthur, but only for those words that would achieve his ambitions. My father was a liar, upon my oath. Then we have peace, Arthur exclaimed. I had only seen him happier once, and that was when he had wed his Guinevere. But now, amidst the smoke and reek of a battle won, he looked almost as joyful as he had in that flowered glade beside the river. Indeed, he could hardly speak for joy, for he had gained what he wanted more than anything in the world. He had made peace. Messengers went north and south, to Caer-Seuss and to Durnovaria, to Magnis and into Siluria. Lug Vale stank of blood and smoke. Many of the wounded were dying where they had fallen, and their cries were pitiful in the night, while the living huddled round fires and talked of wolves coming from the hills to feast on the battle's dead. Arthur seemed almost bewildered by the size of his victory. He was now, though he could scarcely comprehend it, the effective ruler of southern Britain, for there were no other men who would dare stand against his army, battered though it was. He needed to talk with Tudric. He needed to send spearmen back to the Saxon frontier. He desperately wanted his good news to reach Guinevere. And all the while, men begged him for favours and land, for gold and rank. Merlin was telling him about the cauldron. Keenaglass wanted to discuss Ael's Saxons, while Arthur wanted to talk of Lancelot and Cynwyn. And Oengus mac Hiram was demanding land, women, gold, and slaves from Siluria. I demanded only one thing on that night, and that one thing Arthur granted me. He gave me Gundlius. The king of Siluria had taken refuge in a small Roman-built temple that was attached to the larger Roman house in the small village. The temple was made of stone, and had no windows except for a crude hole set into its high gable to let smoke out, and only one door which opened onto the house's stable-yard. Gundlius had tried to escape from the Vale, but his horse had been cut down by one of Arthur's horsemen, and now, like a rat in its last hole, the king waited his doom. A handful of loyal Silurian spearmen guarded the temple door, but they deserted when they saw my warriors advance out of the dark. Tanabers alone was left to guard the firelit temple, where he had made a small ghost fence by placing two newly severed heads at the foot of the door's twin posts. He saw our spearheads glitter in the stable-yard gate, and he raised his moon-tipped staff as he spat curses at us. He was calling on the gods to shrivel our souls, when, quite suddenly, his screeching stopped. It stopped when he heard Howlbane scraping from her scabbard. At that sound, he peered into the dark yard as Nimue and I advanced together, and, recognizing me, he gave a small frightened cry like the sound of a hare trapped by a wildcat. He knew that I owned his soul, and so he scuttled in terror through the temple door. Nimue kicked the two heads scornfully aside, then followed me inside. She was carrying a sword. My men waited outside. The temple had once been dedicated to some Roman god, though now it was the British gods for whom the skulls were stacked so high against its bare stone walls. The skulls' dark eye sockets gazed blankly towards the twin fires that lit the high, narrow chamber, where Tanabers had made himself a circle of power with a ring of yellowing skulls. He now stood in that circle chanting spells, while behind him, against the far wall where a low stone altar was stained black with sacrificial blood, Gundlius waited with his drawn sword. Tanabers, his embroidered robe spattered with mud and blood, raised his staff and hurled foul curses at me. He cursed me by water and by fire, by earth and by air, by stone and by flesh, by dewfall and by moonlight, by life and by death. And not one of the curses stopped me, as I slowly walked towards him, with Nimue in her stained white robe beside me. Tanabers spat a final curse, then pointed the staff straight at my face.
"Your mother lives, Saxon!" he cried. "Your mother lives, and her life is mine. You hear me, Saxon?"
He leered at me from inside his circle, and his ancient face was shadowed by the temple's twin fires, which gave his eyes a red, feral threat.
"You hear me?"
he cried again.
"Your mother's soul is mine. I coupled with her to make it so. I made the two-backed beast with her, and drew her blood to make her soul mine. Touch me, Saxon, and your mother's soul goes to the fire dragons. She will be crushed by the ground, burned by the air, choked by the water, and thrust into pain for evermore. And not just her soul, Saxon, but the soul of every living thing that ever slithered from her loins. I put her blood into the ground, Saxon, and slid my power into her belly."
He laughed and raised his staff high towards the temple's beamed roof.
"Touch me, Saxon, and the curse will take her life, and through her life yours."
He lowered the staff so it pointed at me again.
"But let me go, and you and she will live."
I stopped at the circle's edge. The skulls did not make a ghost fence, but there was still a dreadful power in their array. I could feel that power like unseen wings battering great strokes to baffle me. Cross the skull circle, I thought, and I would enter the gods' playground, to contend against things I could not imagine, let alone understand. Tanabers saw my uncertainty and smiled in triumph.
"Your mother is mine, Saxon," he crooned. "Made mine, all mine. Her blood and soul and body are mine, and that makes you mine, for you were born in blood and pain from my body."
He moved his staff so that its moon tip touched my breast.
"Shall I take you to her, Saxon? She knows you live, and a 2-day journey will bring you back to her."
He smiled wickedly.
"You're mine," he cried. "All mine. I am your mother and your father, your soul and your life. I made the charm of oneness on your mother's womb, and you are now my son. Ask her."
He twitched his staff towards Nimue.
"She knows that charm."
Nimue said nothing, but just stared balefully at Gundlius, while I looked into the druid's horrid eyes. I was frightened to cross his circle, terrified by his threats. But then, in a sickening rush, the events of that long-ago night came back to me as if they had happened just yesterday. I remembered my mother's cries, and I remembered her pleading with the soldiers to leave me at her side, and I remembered the spearmen laughing and striking her head with their spear-staves, and I remembered this cackling druid with the hairs and moons on his robe and the bones in his hair, and I remembered how he had lifted me and fondled me and said what a fine gift for the gods I would make. All that I remembered, just as I remembered being lifted up, screaming for my mother who could not help me, and I remembered being carried through the twin lines of fire where the warriors danced and the women moaned, and I remembered Tanabers holding me high above his tonsured head as he walked to the edge of a pit that was a black circle in the earth, surrounded by fires whose flames burned bright enough to illuminate the blood-smeared tip of a sharpened stake that protruded from the bowels of the round dark pit. The memories were like pain serpents biting at my soul, as I remembered the bloody scraps of flesh and skin hanging from the firelit stake, and the half-comprehended horror of the broken bodies that writhed in slow, pitiful agony as they died in the bloody darkness of this druid's death pit. And I remembered how I still screamed for my mother, as Tanabers lifted me to the stars and prepared to give me to his gods. "To Gofanon!" he had shouted, and my mother screamed as she was raped, and I screamed because I knew I was going to die. "To Clelor!" Tanabor shouted. "To Cernunius! To Taranis! To Socelos! To Bel!" And on that last great name he had hurled me down onto the killing stake. And he had missed. My mother had been screaming, and I still heard her screams as I kicked my way through Tanaber's circle of skulls, and her screams melded into the druid's shriek as I echoed his long-ago cry of death. "To Bel!" I shouted. Howlbane cut down, and I did not miss. Howlbane cut Tanabers down through the shoulder, down through the ribs, and such was the sheer blood-sodden anger in my soul that Howlbane cut on down through his scrawny belly and deep into his stinking bowels, so that his body burst apart like a rotted corpse, and all the time I screamed the awful scream of a little child being given to the death pit. The skull circle filled with blood, and my eyes with tears as I looked up at the king who had slain Rala's child and Mordred's mother, the king who had raped Nimue and taken her eye, and, remembering that pain, I took Howlbane's hilt in both my hands and wrenched the blade free of the dirty offal at my feet, and stepped across the druid's body to carry death to Gundlius. "He's mine!" Nimue shouted at me. She had taken off her eye patch so that her empty socket leered red in the flamelight. She walked past me, smiling. "You're mine," she crooned. "All mine." And Gundlius screamed. And perhaps, in the other world, Norwenna heard that scream, and knew that her son, her little winter-born son, was still the king. That was The Winter King by Bernard Cornwell. Narrated by Jonathan Keeble.